Well, thank you for being with us today. Could you introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about yourself?
Well, my name is John Giannetti. I've lived in this area all my life. I served in the Marine Corps. It was the only time I was ever away from this area. I'm with my brother, partner in this company, Giannetti Studios, where we are. We're at Giannetti Studios now. And it's a business that my father started. We call ourselves architectural sculptors. We don't sculpt figures, but we sculpt architectural features like you can see here on the walls, different things like that. We worked in the White House and a lot of historic places. I personally have been very involved in historic preservation most of my adult life. And about more than 40 years ago, we started down in Bladensburg restoring an old historic tavern. And that's how I sort of got involved. But one of the reasons I was drawn to that is while I was in the Marine Corps, we studied about the history of the Marines. And I can remember reading about the Battle of Bladensburg, like you were talking about earlier with Joanna. And we never, we always thought of it, oh, it's a terrible loss. It was a tragedy, a catastrophe. They burned Washington. And that's all I really knew about it. Well, when I was in the Marine Corps, and the Marines were very proud of the fact that when the Battle of Bladensburg was occurring, the Marines and flotilla men, these Navy, could almost call them Navy SEALs, that forerunner of that sort of as a separate organization from the United States Navy. But these flotilla men were trying to fight the British and keep them from burning the plantations up and down the Chesapeake Bay. So the Marines were proud of the fact that when everyone was retreating from the battlefield, the Marines stood their ground with the flotilla men. It was about 400 or 500, there were maybe as many as 600 flotilla men and Marines and a few militia. So not all of the militia retreated. Now, they retreated because in many respects, they were ordered. There was a lot of disorganization. They were thrown together in this one day for this battle down at Bladensburg. Things started going bad as soon as there was a very furious, short battle at the bridge at Bladensburg. But once the British forced their way across the bridge, and incidentally, they took a lot of casualties doing that. In fact, the total amount of casualties was, I've heard figures of 550 British casualties. The Americans took somewhere in the neighborhood of 350, according to some historians. That's total for the whole event.
Real quick, was it kind of almost a David and Goliath sort of battle? Was there more British than there were Americans?
Well, not really. There were more Americans, but they were militia. They were untrained, sort of civilian militia.
Okay.
Pulled together here quickly in one day. They had never trained together, worked together, except the day of the battle. And they were from Baltimore, they were from Annapolis, they were from Northern Virginia, Alexandria, there was troops from Rockville. Troops were just all brought together. There were a few regular Army units, one Army unit that were regulars, but they were ordered to retreat early in the battle, and so they actually pulled back. Now, Barney came along sort of at the tail end of the battle because he was down protecting one of the bridges crossing the Anacostia River. So he marched up, and when he got here, the retreat was already sort of taking place. As everybody was leaving, and he was ordered to retreat, and he said, "We just got here. We're not retreating. We just got here." And so they had cannons with them, and they really put up quite a battle. Now, once the British got across, and then they had reinforcements come across, the Marines and the flotilla men counterattacked several times. And this is what I was saying. The Marines were sort of proud of the fact that they did put up a battle, and they were sort of recognized for their valor and courage. And let's call it a sort of a resolve, resolve not to retreat. They were going to stand and fight. They could have almost turned that battle around, and there are a few British accounts that recorded the fact that these guys really put up a battle. Well, when Barney was wounded and they were completely surrounded, almost surrounded, and he said, look, there's nothing we can do. We drop back and that's it. Well, Barney was left on the battlefield there, and one of his men stayed with him. But the British came up, and very quickly, they called the commander of the British forces, Major General Robert Ross, and Admiral Cockburn. He was the Navy part of it, but it was Ross that really conducted the battle and forced the bridge and won the battle. And so when he walked up and he said, man, you guys really put up a fight, you know, it was amazing. And so they have even recorded the wordings that were used. Barney said, well, you've got me now. And Cockburn and Ross said, no, look, we're sorry to see that you're wounded. You guys put up a heck of a fight. We knew it was somebody other than the militia that would put up such a fight. And so they paroled him right on the spot. Very sort of, they were reaching out to their fallen foe, sort of a magnanimous gesture of chivalry. And they took him into Bladensburg. But one of the things, there were 70 British soldiers that were on the battlefield that couldn't leave. They were so wounded so poorly. So they told Barney, they said, look, we'll put you in charge of these guys, make sure that they get proper care. So Barney was sort of looking after the British wounded. And this is recorded in textbooks, and this, one of the great historians that my opinion was a fellow named John Giannetti, who wrote a book about all of this and the activity that Barney was down on a stretcher down in Bladensburg when they had carried him down there, and one of his wounded Marines came up to him. He was wounded, badly wounded himself, and his arm was hanging down, and he saw Barney there, and he went up and he said, it was such an honor to fight with you, and he kissed Barney's hand and said, I was proud to stand with you. Even though the battle was lost, I was proud to do it. Now, several British that recorded this said, boy, they were really amazed. They said, boy, that guy's a heck of a leader, that his men would, or one man came up and actually kissed his hand.
Yeah.
And so this is something that's always bothered me. I always grew up within 2 miles of the battlefield, and I never knew all about this, and this is really what we're trying to tell, that yes, they surprised us, yes, they won the battle. They had these Congreve rockets firing overhead. Well, the militia had never seen anything like this. It just generally inspired terror in their hearts, and once the British got across the bridge and was arrayed before them, they were ordered to fall back. Well, once the first line started falling back, then some of the others, thought it was like a retreat. It turned into a rout. But when Barney came up and saw everybody retreating, he said, no, we're not. We're going to stand our ground. And they did for several hours. They counterattacked. And from what I understand from the writings of Giannetti and others, that the Marines took the majority of the casualties at the end of the battle there. So when I say casualties, I don't mean they were all killed, but there were certainly some that died right there on the battlefield. And there were others who were wounded, like Barney. His wounds eventually killed him, but not for several years.
Yeah, I think it was 7 years.
7 years,
like that.
yeah. He still had that shot in his leg, and it probably got infected. But I've always felt, ever since I discovered this and learned a little bit more about the battle, I said it's always, these guys marched out to Bladensburg to put their life on the line. the soldiers, sailors, and Marines. And this statue, this sculpture, a commemorative monument, is to try to at least remember these guys. And I don't believe in ghosts, but I'll tell you, I still feel that these guys, well, let's put it this way. They're dead, but they're not gone.
Right.
They may be hidden, but they're revealed. And although they may be dead, I think they still speak. And I think we owe that much to them after 200 years to at least show that we remember these guys that marched out to Bladensburg, offered their lives. Yes, we retreated from the battlefield, but not everybody retreated. And those guys that fought and died and were wounded, I think they should be remembered. And I think that's what this is all about. So in a way, like you were talking about earlier about history, this sort of will bring people's idea that, you have to stand and fight sometimes.
Yeah.
And so that's what we're talking about here. So I don't know whether you have any other questions, but
I'll have a few more. But
yeah. I you were talking about how does this associate with historic preservation. Actually, that's what our group is. The Aim and Trust was the main thrust of this thing. We sort of came up with the idea of having a monument on the 200th anniversary, and so the Aim and Trust is a historic preservation organization. That's what we were founded to do. We've worked on the restoration of some of the historic structures that are still in Bladensburg, and there are several of them, and we've been very active. Eamon was a newspaper, owner of a newspaper, the Prince George's Post. When he died and his wife died, they left a portion of their estate to form a trust that might look after some of these historic structures. And that's what we've been doing for almost 40 years now. And so we were established, and we came up with this idea to have this. We've put like $60,000 of our money into it. Now, we're a very small organization, but we wanted to show that we were really behind this idea. We hired a sculptor. We now have a bronze foundry and the stone people that are going to be working on it. So I think that you were talking about this thing as a very emotional looking thing now.
Yeah, you look at it and it really does convey the emotion.
Well, that's exactly what we were trying to do. We didn't want to just have some little monument there that really didn't, we wanted something that was really nice, that was worthy of the sacrifice that they made. And I think, when you think of the sadness that must have occurred at the time of that battle, and everybody's feeling is a terrible loss, but art, there's beauty in art. And when you put the beauty together with the sadness of this event, it sort of tempers the sadness of it. I don't know whether I'm making my point.
No, I get exactly what you're saying.
But it's sort of an uplifting emotion. Okay, we lost the battle, but look, here's some guys that fought to the end till they couldn't fight anymore. And I think that's an uplifting kind of a thing, and that's what the whole sculpture, once you have the entablature, the stone, it will have a funereal effect. But I think we're trying to overcome the melancholy of the loss of the battle by having the beauty of a sculpture that will temper that melancholy.
Well, it really seems like it's instead of dwelling on the defeat, it's really championing, or I think I say this, it's really showing the strength and the perseverance.
Yes.
And it feels more like perseverance because the statue, he is rising back up, even though
That's
he's
right.
injured.
Yeah.
They're helping, they're going along, and it's focusing on that strength and that will to just keep going instead of just.
And that's exactly what we're hoping, that when young people come and they'll look at this, and like you were saying, most people don't know a lot about the War of 1812. They just know a few facts about it. But when they come and they see this, we're hoping that that will engender a fighting spirit, a little bit of a fighting spirit. Look, these guys didn't retreat. You can't give up. You have to keep fighting. And so that's what we were hoping to accomplish with this thing. But as well as showing that that there were, naturally Commodore Joshua Barney was the leader, and he was the main guy that caused them to fight. The Marines were 100% behind him, the flotilla men, and I think it's interesting that Charles Ball, who's an African American, this event took place 50 years before the Emancipation Proclamation. Couldn't they have seen then that this was something that they should do? I mean, Charles Ball wrote about being happy to be able to fight for his country. And after the Battle of Bladensburg, and he went up to Baltimore and fought up at Fort McHenry when the British tried to land a landing party to take the fort on the ground. These flotilla men were there to stop them, and they turned those Marines, those British Marines, away. And so Ball wrote about these things. So that's why we included him in there. I mean, he was a fighter, and that's what we need. We need people that will fight, not be willing to fight. And he was very, he wrote a book about, I guess maybe he didn't write it, but a book was written about his exploits during the War of 1812, and so that's how we know all about this guy.
Now, the statue, we heard about that has to go get bronzed, or has to go through the bronzing process. When is it slated to be actually unveiled and put up? What's the time frame?
We're hoping that we can have this thing by August 24th, 2013. Now that's a year before the battle, but we're finding out that these things usually take longer than you would ever think. So we're hoping to have it, but we will definitely have this thing. The official dedication will be August 24th, 2014. We're hoping to have the Marines there. We're hoping to really make a big event of it and have a historian there telling about the battle and telling about, all of the aspects of the battle, not just the fact that the battle was lost, but to tell about how and why it was lost. And so we hope to make that a big event. Now it's interesting, I mentioned Major General Robert Ross was the British commander who won the battle, let's say. His great-great-great-grandson in England, actually he's in Scotland now, has gotten in touch with us, and he heard about the fact that we were doing this memorial, and he has sent us a very, very generous contribution, a very substantial contribution. And we are going to, on the back of the memorial, will be an interpretive panel, and we're going to tell about not only Barney and the Battle of Bladensburg, but also how Major General Robert Ross, the victor of the battle, came up and paroled Barney right on the spot. I think it was a very magnanimous gesture on his part. And the fact that the British are now our closest allies, I mean, let's face it, they're our very, very best friends in every sense of the word. So I think he reached out, and I thought it showed a great spirit to do that on his part. And not only that, they have a sword that has been with their family all these years, passed down from generation to generation. It's a sword that looks like Barney's sword. They thought that it might have been Barney's sword. So he is returning that sword to us, and it will be put in a museum here in Washington, but eventually right here at our visitor center. So I think it's an interesting side story.
And it's amazing kind of the connections that you make, and you would think that after all these years it would be lost, or
That's right.
Why would they even think to contact you? But it's amazing the
that
connection.
he heard about it, and he was happy that we were happy to include him in this. And he's a wonderful guy. I haven't really talked to him on the phone. We just sent emails back and forth and a couple of letters. But it's interesting that his great-great-great-grandfather, Major General Ross, was actually knighted, and all of his family was then allowed to use the term Ross of Bladensburg attached to their name. And even though this guy's name is Hamilton, he still has that right to use Ross of Bladensburg. But he said he doesn't use it. But in all my correspondence to him, I've included Ross of Bladensburg to show that we respect what his feelings as well. Very nice gentleman.
Now, do you have any upcoming preservation projects going on separate from this?
Well, of course, our main concentration is Bladensburg, historic properties in and around Bladensburg, and because of the bicentennial, we're trying to make accommodations for several of the buildings that we're involved in to try to spruce things up. We would like to see, there's a historic house in Bladensburg called the Bostwick House. It's owned by the city of Bladensburg, the town of Bladensburg, but we're trying to get that, doing what we can to help preserve and to restore that. We haven't really started on an actual restoration project, but the one that we're closely associated with that started this whole thing was the George Washington House in Bladensburg. It's an old tavern that was built in the 1700s, and they think that George Washington actually visited this place, and so it was restored, and I guess that's where I got started back for the American bicentennial, 1976. And so we bought this organization that at that time was the JCs. We bought the old tavern, and we had it restored, and we set up a museum inside for the bicentennial. And it's interesting because one of the main displays in there was a big diorama about 10 feet long about the Battle of Bladensburg. But it was hard to maintain that museum. They maintained it for about 10 years after the bicentennial. But it's interesting that of all the JC projects in the United States in 1976, our little organization, Prince George's JCs, won the #1 JC project in America. So it was pretty
working
significant.
hard.
Yeah, that's right. And so I've been involved ever since those years, because that led to the Amen Trust being established, and then I've been working on historic preservation ever since, and now this is sort of a culmination and part of the legacy of the Amen Trust.
Do you see more, just because you've been in this for a while, you said
Yes.
about 40 years, do you see more preservation? Is there more people interested in preservation now than? Is it about the same?
Well, no, I think people are involved. We've gone through a terrible recession here recently, and I think things have dropped off a little bit. I mean, there hasn't been as much money, but I think the preservation that's occurred in Bladensburg and in Prince George's County has spurred, and Baltimore, and trying to preserve our historic landmarks, I think, are very important to preserving our history. And this is where we came from and how we got there. And I think it's really important. And although there was a little drop off during these last few years, I was happy that we were able to do this and to convince the state legislature to give us some of the money that we needed. We got a grant from the state. We got grants from other historic preservation organizations. We're still hoping maybe to get a grant from the bicentennial, I think it's called the Star Spangled 200. We're really hoping that we can complete this as we intended from the beginning. But you know, it's a long way from coming up with an idea to actually making it happen. But we're getting ready to send this off to the Bronze Foundry, and it's going to happen, and we have enough money to complete the project.
Well, that's excellent.
And so I think that that's great, and I really think that it's all based on historic preservation, preserving the history of our area. I just like to say that don't forget about the last stand that Barney put up at Bladensburg. I mean, when everybody was retreating, the Marines and flotillamen led by Commodore Joshua Barney, to me, is a very significant, epic event.
Well, thank you very much.
All right.
Thank you for talking with us.
Thank you.
Good
Nice
luck.